I've been watching She-Ra Princesses of Power for the very first time, and I came across season 2, episode 3, Signals. It's obviously meant to have like an eerie vibe to it, what with the haunted forest setting and the ghost stories and the jump scares, but when I was watching it, I just wasn't scared? I mean, the stereotypically scary stuff wasn't scary, but when we were in the Horde, which is like same old, it's terrible, but it's not necessarily scary, oh my gosh, that was terrifying. And I got this old brain of mine thinking, why would they keep the scenes with the princesses if they are so cheesy and not scary at all? How did they make the Horde scene so scary? I mean, I was literally on the edge of my seat. And is there any way that I can reverse engineer what I've learned about how they create terror in this episode to help me with my anxiety in everyday life? Let's talk about it.
We must be strong. We must be brave. We gotta find every bit of strength that we have and never let it go. Hey, Adora.
Like most episodes within the show, the plot is split up between the princesses and the Horde. Let's examine the princesses first, because it introduces 3 key elements of scary storytelling that are then utilized to create a sense of unease within us as the audience when watching the Horde scenes. So what happens with the princesses? Bo, Glimmer, Swiftwind, and Adora, the best friends quad, set out to check on Aylwin, a resource post that's gone silent. Upon arrival, Swiftwind notes that he senses something weird, which is to be taken seriously because he is a magically sentient, flying rainbow horse who has been brought to life through a She-Ra sword. And Aylwin is definitely different. It's full of shadows and uncertainty. It feels and is abandoned, prompting questions like what happened here and why did they abandon this place? Introducing our very first element of scary storytelling, a sense of the unknown. Now there's something very important that I want to highlight here, how each character deals with the discomfort of the unknown. Because the unknown isn't a very comfortable thing, right? Our brains are wired to look for the bad stuff so we'll be prepared for it. So an unknown just feels crappy. Sooner or later, we're going to be doing some coping strategies to try and feel better. So Bo's checking his tracker pad, but it's just not working. So he draws his bow so he'll be ready in the event that he needs to fight. Adora is telling scary stories, either trying to identify potential threats in the Weeping Princess, who is actually inspired by Mexican folklore, or, and I think this is more likely, she's trying to take control of the narrative. If she's the one telling the scary stories, then she's the one facilitating the fear. It's not because there's an actual threat, it's because she's telling scary stories. Each of the characters are doing things that are intrinsically comforting to them, but as they're doing that, they're unintentionally triggering each other into feeling more anxiety. And this actually leads us to the second key element in scary storytelling, making assumptions about the unknown. What's terrifying to one person is laughable to the next. The best way to establish a universal fear factor is to allow the audience to create the fear themselves. This is why suspense is such a useful tool in scary storytelling. You're being fed information about what's happening through a tiny little dropper, so every single second of the experience feels elongated. And this can also be created through a type of editing where you cut between what's happening to the reaction. And if you had a third perspective, like looking at both of them, it would have only happened in 3 seconds, but because you're looking at a 1 second over here, 1 second over here, like the seconds are ticking by painfully slowly, and that creates a sense of suspense. The princess's narrative ends with the quad discovering the truth behind what really happened. Aylwin was abandoned because glitch messages from the first ones, literally the first ones to inhabit the planet of Etheria, which is the whole setting, and they were triggered when a signal tower powered on. These glitched messages appeared as ghostly apparitions wandering about the forests, effectively scaring those residing within Aylwin enough to abandon posts. Which brings us to the third key element of scary storytelling, a sense that things are bigger than life, or an exaggerated sense of reality. The first ones have been set up to have this bigger than life illusion, that they were these giants among children, gods amongst men, yet Adora finds out that they're just people, just like her. And this is the key mindset shift.
I've been thinking of them as these big epic figures, but they're regular people. sending messages to their loved ones.
As the Best Friends quad explores this new information about the first ones and these messages, I love that they showed you how to cope with that feeling of fear or suspense or horror. Bo asked questions, he gathered intel, was fascinated by the technology. Glimmer reminded herself why she was staying, and she utilized community as a tool to help her cope with those feelings. Much like shadow puppeting, scary situations can come to life simply by our brains blowing things out of proportion. And this is because our brains are wired to protect us. If we can potentially prepare for any possible threat, then theoretically we'll be ready for anything. Scenes like this are so scary for the characters because they're directly impacting those characters. For those three key elements to be actually scary in storytelling, it has to be relevant and specific to the audience. And this is why the Horde scenes were actually very, very terrifying. The scenes in the Horde begin with a focus on the main villain, Lord Hordak, I'm not really sure what to call him. He's definitely not a person because he can survive without atmosphere. He has rage problems, and if you doubted that he would ever treat his soldiers with anything but seething hatred, Hordak really corrects that assumption by almost killing Catra via asphyxiation. The Horde is most definitely written to be the villain in the show. It happens to house quite a few characters that we love, actually. We've got Catra, whom I was familiar with even before I knew the show existed because there were just so many fan edits, and she is desperate to prove herself and have some semblance of power, because if you're powerful, then you matter in the Horde. Then we've got Scorpia, who might be one of my absolute favorites in the show so far, who is the sweetest person ever and is simply desperate for Catra's attention. Then we've got Entrapta, the neurodivergent icon queen, princess, who is blissfully ignorant of any and all social cues, motivated by her special interest, science, and is absolutely captivated by the beauty around her. Oh, and Emily! Who could forget Emily? And this is really interesting for me, right? Because we care about a lot of folks who are part of the Horde. And by the evidence from previous episodes and the very first scene in this episode, we see that these characters we care so much about are not safe. The people we care about in the Horde are put into life or death danger just because they exist. And that's the first essential thing that the Horde scenes do differently from the princess scenes. The Horde scenes hit personal. They're specifically relevant to us because now we think about our loved ones when we see Catra, Entrapta, Scorpia, Emily, and when they're in danger, we get scared. Entrapta and Catra are an interesting pair. They're both incredibly loyal, Catra to the Horde, Entrapta to science. They're both impressively determined, yet where Catra is highly aware of potential danger and has memorized social rules and hierarchy within the Horde to get by below the radar, Entrapta is completely unbothered by potential danger in nearly every situation, claiming that there's always a level of danger with experimentation. Entrapta wants something from Hordak's sanctum. And this is terrifying because Catra has plot armor. There's way too much potential angst to be utilized if she's super successful in the Horde and continues to enjoy being away from Adora. If she's cast out of the Horde and joins the princesses, they just wasted so much potential angst between her and Adora. Entrapta, however, I know Hordak is capable of and has the temper to kill Entrapta without a second thought just because she set foot in his sanctum. Or worse, kept alive for torture so that she can live out the horrors that Adora was so terrified of her experiencing that she had just denied experiencing because it wasn't true then, but now all the princesses are convinced that she wants to be here, but now she's going to be tortured, and we can all fill in the blanks with our own assumptions about what happens to Entrapta. And that's what makes the Horde scenes so terrifying. We don't know what's gonna happen to Entrapta. All we can do is make assumptions in hopes that we can prepare our hearts emotionally for what happens when the plot actually reveals it, and that's where we get stuck in the storyboard's trap. He favors Entrapta over Catra, and now we're terrified of all of the implications of what did happen. Entrapta, the one person who could possibly create a working portal using technology and magic together, has been enabled to do just that. Catra, an unstable force who's been given a good amount of responsibility is now reminded of her inferiority. She feels insignificant, reminding her of Adora, which places Adora, whom we also care about, in even more danger. Scorpia, who's literally only hurt by her love for Catra, is now ignored by everyone. By Catra in favor of Adora, and by Entrapta in favor of Horde's science stuff. That's not all. Now the Horde has an unbelievable upper hand over the princesses, reminding us that just because we care about people within the Horde doesn't mean that the Horde cares about the princesses. The people we love are still in incomprehensible danger, and it is so much bigger than we could have ever realized. So the princess's narrative introduced the three key elements of scary storytelling: the vast unknown, individual assumptions, and the dramatic exaggeration. From these three key elements, we're able to fully immerse ourselves in the Horde scenes, so when something's at stake for them, it feels like we have something at stake too. So how can we reverse engineer those three key elements to help us with anxiety in our day-to-day life? To answer that question, I want to point out a little bit of environmental storytelling in the form of the episode titles. The episode we've been talking about is Season 2, Episode 3, Signals. The second episode is Ties That Bind, and the fourth is called Roll With It. Put together, the environmental storytelling here is that fear is a tie that binds you. It keeps you from doing what has to get done. But in the end, you just gotta roll with it. And how do we get from that fear to rolling with the fear? Signals. We can use those three key elements of scary storytelling to signal to us that we're engaging in some scary storytelling in our own lives. Maybe we notice a bunch of unknown variables in life. That could be a signal to us that we might start feeling distressed or dysregulated. We can get a head start on self-regulation by engaging in self-care activities. Or maybe we find ourselves making assumptions about some situation in our life. Maybe there's something that's going to happen, like a test, and we start telling ourselves, oh my gosh, I'm gonna fail that test, I'm gonna fail that test. That's an assumption, and that can be a signal to just stop and pause and wonder whether or not our perception of the event is actually true or good or helpful. If something's worth worrying about, it's also worth hoping about. Finally, the dramatic exaggeration, or the sense that things are larger than life. In my experience, that actually has a name, and it's called catastrophizing. I'm still working on figuring that one out. Like, a couple of weeks ago, I fell and hit my head, and I jumped to the conclusion that I automatically must have a concussion, but I didn't have a concussion at all, and assuming I had a concussion caused so much of a stress reaction, I had a way worse migraine attack than I would have otherwise. A quick Google search about catastrophic thinking suggests staying specific. Maybe you can't believe that everything's gonna work out and that there is good in the world, but can you find a very specific part of your life that brings you joy in some way? Sleeping. Quote, there is evidence that sleep deprivation makes us more hypersensitive to threat, which leads to more negative interpretations of things, the result being that we become focused on molehills, which we then turn into mountains. Understanding that thoughts do not define us. This one kind of reminds me of a YouTuber I've recently started watching whose catchphrase at the end of her videos is, don't believe everything your brain tells you. And getting physical, which could be anything from stimming to doing grounding techniques to going for a nature walk to opening the window so you have a little fresh air, anything to get your body moving and giving yourself regulating sensory input. There are a lot of terrifying things happening right now. There are so many unknown factors, biased assumptions, and things that are blown way out of proportion, while other things that are genuinely that terrifying are pushed by the wayside. It is a hard thing to feel safe in a world that is so overwhelmed with chaos and fear. But I do challenge you to join me in creating safe spaces for ourselves by first being that safe space for ourselves. Reading from one of my favorite books, carefully weigh and examine what people tell you. Let us continue to love each other, because there is no room in love for fear. Well-formed love banishes fear. Let's make the difference we want to see in the world.